So, shall I share my screen?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see.
Thanks, Angus.
Right. I'm keeping this super simple. You should all just see a picture if I've done this correct.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Where shall I start? Perhaps if I start with uh, a book that I've been reading alongside The Philosophy of Freedom is the book by Prokofiev, Anthroposophy and the Philosophy of Freedom. And for anybody else who's read that book, they'll recognise this. So I've sort of been playing around with an art program, so his is as like a black and white thing. But I think there's a lot of value in the schematic that he's drawn up in that book for really getting an overview of what's going on in this picture in a very um, easy to survey mode. So, what's going on in this chapter? What are some of the things that I've been focusing on? The first part is Steiner is looking obviously at sort of our motives, and he compares a little bit the difference between the quality of motives in the sense that if it's going to be a positive a positive moral motive, then they tend to be very limited, and they're of little value. And he talks about it's like cleaning the street, paying your taxes in a certain office, and that type of thing. And he compares them those more limited maxims or motives with the forbidding of certain actions or the forbidding of certain ways of living, and he talks about how these are in nature more conceptual in the sense that they aren't limited to like very specific concrete actions, so they allow for a conceptual idea to become manifested in lots of different ways. And he talks about usually these are imposed it's like there's threats of sanctions and that type of thing that are constraining people or getting people to conform to these motives. And then he goes on to talk about what's the situation with positive motives, like you should do good. And already there, we're faced with a challenge because there's no well, if we look at our if I look at our picture, in the sense that if we think about this, you should do good motive, then what we might be tempted to do is to draw on things that we've seen, things that we've been shown how to do good, the mental pictures that we have about what it is to be good. And he talks about how these are unfree in nature because they've come from outside, and that if we're going to resolve this inner freedom aspect of the question, i.e., there's no external compulsion entering into my actions, into the motives for my actions, then we need another source of input, for want of a better word, that will allow us to create new content that is out of our own inner being. And there's what's my reading of it is that it's like as we contemplate, it's like a moral maxim, and if we hold it in our eye for a while, then one of the things that can arise is sort of like a new picture that is generated out of that contemplated moral motive. And it might well take the form of a picture of something that we can do. And this is because this has been completely generated out of ourselves, it's like still fulfills the freedom necessity that we've talked about. It's like as an ethical individualist here. Furthermore, this moral imagination, I'm going to skip the moral intuition for a little bit, and we might come back to it in the conversation. But I could, if I just add, it's like adding details, conceptual details to how that picture might be implemented. We've got the other big question about, so we've got these pictures living within us, but if we don't know how the world works, he talks about this is the realm of science, this is the realm of understanding, this is the realm of knowledge. Our moral imagination needs to reconcile itself with moral technique, i.e. the ability to implement, it's like to be implemented in the world. And when these components are in place in our inner life, then so we can flow back into what he calls like the path of action. So we're incarnating our moral life into the real world again, where those actions become obviously percepts, can then become mental pictures, and then we'll leave the last bit there. So this picture that's being built up here is this continuous, this infinity loop that we've got here. We've got the path of thinking, which goes through the eye and through a contemplating conceptual content or motives. In this case, we can be inspired by something beyond us, which then traces around these areas that I very briefly described, and then can incarnate, if you like, into the world, and then it continues to exist and has its effect in the world. And one of the other major part, there are several parts that I've skipped over, but the other major part of the chapter here is how Steiner is reconciling. He's saying that this ethical individualism model that he's proposing here is what's he call it? He calls it the crowning of the theory of evolution. And I think this is a very interesting description, because what he's saying is that, in the sense that he talks about proto-amniotics and reptiles, that if you just had a proto-amniotic being in front of you and you'd never seen a reptile, you would never be able to predict that coming out of it. You can talk about irreducible computation. I was watching a video by a guy called Wolfram, and there are certain things that cannot be reduced down to theory. They have to be implemented, and this irreducible computation is another way also of describing what the theory of evolution is. These things have to come about, and they live in the world, and then they have their effect on the world, and there's a feedback loop going on. But we're not talking about in the sense that everything was already predetermined in the proto-amniotic. Evolution, genuine evolution, had to happen out of that, and that this is also how we can understand the development of the moral life of the human beings. And I would take that to another plane and say that the development of all civilizations is also evidence of this same theory, where we as human beings, we have this moral imagination, and let's say we want to build, it's like a place of worship, and we're used to little caves in the ground, and we think, oh, let's build a cathedral. So you need that imagination there, that grand vision. You need the detailed knowledge of construction and a relationship to the outer world, which are given to you through moral intuition, moral technique, and then you can start to implement those ideas and they become part of reality. So this image that he gives us, that a true understanding of the theory of evolution doesn't restrict itself purely to the material realm, is also exactly the same theory can be used to justify the ethical individualism that he's been talking about and developing in the previous chapters. And one of the thoughts that I was harboring is when he was talking a lot about the theory of evolution, I was thinking specifically of Karl Popper and his line of thinking, which was basically that the theory of evolution isn't a scientific theory because it's not falsifiable and it has no predictive abilities. And if we take that on board, and I know there are arguments or partial arguments against that, but if we take that in its essence, we can also say that this is actually true about the moral life of the human beings as it individuates into species, that there isn't a predictable element in it. It's not predetermined. It's determined by the own inner necessity it creates. And yeah, I think that's the basics of what I'm taking from the chapter there. I'm just looking at my notes and see if there's anything else I think was important to include that I missed. Perhaps it's just worth restating for total clarity's sake that whereas the proto-amniotic had no say, or it wasn't conscious of itself and it wasn't able to consciously affect its eventual development into the reptile. This is the fundamental difference for Steiner, of course, is that that's exactly what we as free, as potentially free spiritual beings are capable of through the harboring of specific maxims that we've chosen ourselves out of knowledge. Then we become our own creators. I'm just going to, I've done a slight variation on these pictures, very minor details, just to show how they also integrate with anthroposophy, i.e. that which this book isn't about. But I think it's interesting what Prokofiev does. So this, as you see, I've really just changed the labels. So here we've still got, we're talking about the same areas here, but this is the moral imagination is using thinking as an organ of perception, and that becomes imaginative consciousness in anthroposophical terms. And inspirational consciousness is that which is based out of the organ of the feeling life. And then moral technique is the fruit of the will organ and so is part of intuition consciousness. And then one final one, just a slight change on this one here. He also maps, this is Prokofiev I'm talking about here, that this period we are in now is really this development of this exceptional state, this consciousness soul aspect where we become conscious of the way in which we can create our own freedom, and that in the following periods. So this is the Russian period. A moral imagination will be the focus. In the American period, moral intuition will be the focus, and then the first period of the next epoch, which doesn't have a name yet, as far as I'm aware, it's like the focus of development for humanity is going to be moral technique. And then we've got these like slight overviews here that the first 7 chapters of the book are really focused around understanding, really coming to terms with this part of the lemniscate, and the second part is the moral life, and it's better understanding how the inner moral life is constructed and makes its way back into what we normally call real life on the path of deeds. And that's it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Angus. A thought I had, as I was reading this chapter and listening to Steiner discussing the notion that, which is not held by a lot of thinkers today, who think of evolution in a kind of deterministic way, but that ethical individualism, the way he describes it as a natural emergence out of biological evolution, and just this concept of emergence as like a way of conceptualizing the fact that you can't derive the reptile out of the earlier animal form, and so you can't just reduce the experience of freedom to what we discern as instinct at work in the, I guess, lower kingdoms of nature. Just some thoughts. Anybody have any thoughts to share? Comment?
Oh, go ahead, Max. I'll go after you.
You're muted, Max.
Thanks. Okay, folks, hear me now? Okay, great. No, I'll just share a thought I had reading this chapter, and I think it dovetails nicely with what Angus laid out. This is something drawing on something from outside of philosophy of freedom, but nevertheless, I think related. And one fruitful question for me has always been, like, actually trying to discern the connection between the philosophy of freedom path and then like some of the other anthroposophical paths that Steiner lays out. And I was reflecting on the meditation that he gives on numerous occasions around the rose cross. And so he describes building up this image, and he in every case he describes it in a really particular way. He describes it as like starting from concepts of different concepts about what it means for growth and decay, and what it means for something to be purified of baser impulses and so on. And you end up with this picture of a cross with black crosses representing like what has to be kind of purified, and then out of which the roses will bloom. And I was thinking of this, and then I in light of a specific line in this chapter, which in many ways I read as kind of like a crucial line. He says, "Therefore, I am free only when I produce these mental pictures myself, not merely when I can carry out motives that another has placed within me." And so this idea of, he says somewhere else, I think, freedom, that a free deed has to pass from concept through mental picture to action. And if you don't have that sequence, then the deed can't be free. And I just, in light of that statement from Steiner in this chapter, the Rose Cross meditation suddenly it became it was illuminated for me, and I thought of it as almost this like overarching uh, um, act. It's not really, it's hard to think of it as an act, but it's like if we start with those concepts and then produce this this symbolic mental picture of the rose cross, then it's like out of that mental picture flows forth deeds and actions that are coming from this place in us that is at the vanguard of evolution, which is to say, as free spiritual beings. So that was a thought that was with me as I was reading the chapter, and I don't know, perhaps somebody else will wish to build on that.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, Angus, for your summary and translation of what's going on in the philosophy of freedom to the broader context of anthroposophy. I wanted to pick up on evolutionary ideas that Steiner's discussing in this chapter, and I'm glad you brought in Karl Popper, Angus, who tried to develop an evolutionary epistemology, but at the same time thought of evolution not as a theory, but as a fact, I think he would say, which is to say that it's a historical account that's full of contingencies and so on. And he didn't obviously have the spiritual perspective on this process that Steiner does, but I think he did correctly recognize what Steiner's trying to say here, which is that, if we were to take a perspective in the cosmic ether, as it were, as though we were, billions of years ago or whatever, looking at the formation of our solar system, or looking at single-celled creatures or reptiles or so on, even if we did have complete knowledge at either of these earlier stages of cosmic evolution, we never could have predicted what would come next, because it's not a merely there's more going on than just what we can perceive. There's an inner dimension to it, and that inner dimension is the human being. And modern science, whether physics or biology, has tended to put the observer outside the process of evolution, to view it from the outside, as it were, and Steiner's cosmology is putting us back into the process. And in some ways, I think this is how I understand it, that the human being is sort of this bridge between the spiritual and the natural worlds. And in our current moment, through our cultivation of intuitive thinking and moral action, we're allowing the spiritual world to transform the physical world, right? Through our free deeds, we become capable of furthering this process of evolution, and then recognizing that what might look like a merely natural or physical process when viewed from the outside is in fact continuous with our own spiritual activity, if we view it rightly from the inside out, as it were. And I think here, it's not as obvious in this chapter that Steiner is sort of in dialogue with the New Testament, but I thought here of Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8, around verse 21, 22, where he talks about all of creation groaning as if in the pains of birth or labor, kind of waiting for human beings to awaken to their spiritual mission, and that only once the human being has sort of understood evolution aright as a spiritual process can the rest of the natural world be restored to its proper station, right? And so it's a cosmological gospel in a sense, not just about saving human beings, but the human being isn't in reality the whole of the cosmos or a microcosm. So I just felt this verse from Romans sort of echoing in the background as I read this chapter. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Max.
I just wanted to pick up on Matt's comment about evolution. And the picture that we get, of course, is like an organism that is being that is receiving pressure from the environment, that basically pushes the organism or the species, I guess, towards development in a given direction. And the implication of that is, well, you just consider everything. Every other organism constitutes the environment for a given organism. And so you have to, to think about evolution the right way, you have to see everything as like what Matt said about, the groaning and travailing. Everything actually is integral, and it comes like part and parcel. In that way, everything comes together. Again, because of that mutual relation between organism and environment. Like we are part of the environment for all of the, we're part of the environment for every other organism. And so one of the, I think what Steiner is kind of alluding to when he makes that statement about the way people think about evolution can't possibly be how it is, but then he just as a sort of offhand remark, one thing to consider is like the accounts that we usually cook up about how the life or the cosmos would have looked at some distant time in the past. In a certain way, it's actually sins against the very like doctrine of evolution itself, because it's what we're saying is if an organism with like the specific, if a nervous system like the human being that we're familiar with, if a nervous system like that existed at a time prior to any nervous system like that having developed, then here's how it might look. But of course, that contradicts the very doctrine of evolution to begin with, which is the fact that this organism or this nervous system exists right now is a function of everything that has led up to this. And so it's completely like tearing the thing apart to then abstractly place a human type observer in some distant past before a human type observer could have possibly emerged.
Thanks, Max. Yeah. That particular kind of nervous system and its world, right, enshrines that particular world as the basis for coming up with a narrative about what things were like however many years back. Angus?
Yeah, I was going to come back to. I threaded in a word there, irreducible. Computation, which might seem like totally out of place here, but I was digging into it a little bit, and it's saying the same thing as Max is saying and Matt's saying. And when we were talking about the rose, it's like growing out of its environment there. So like the rose seed can't just grow on its own. It needs the soil, it needs the sun, it needs the water so that it can generate its own being. And it's worth reflecting on this irreducible computation or freedom here. What this? So I want to get irreducible freedom computation. What does it mean? It basically means you have to run through all the iterations of a process. You can't take any shortcuts. Each and every, there's no predictable pattern in there, and it's a branch within mathematics. But what's one of the fundamental characteristics of it apart from that? It's very similar to this idea that there is an environment that I'm working in, and then there's another world that's sort of like that's not related to it, but the two are sort of like somehow interacting. The one is informing the other. And I think this is what's at the heart of the problem of people who try to understand freedom out of a materialistic perspective. It's impossible, because there is no other realm for them. Everything is only material. And so if you haven't got another realm out of which things can like come into being, then freedom always has to be an illusion. But just to bring into like another area of science which like on the surface might not seem to have much in common here, is if we look at the quantum mechanics, this idea that things are continually coming into being and coming into existence and going out of existence. And there also we've got this dynamism, which I think we experience when we look at when we think about how Steiner's describing how moral motives, how motives like informs like a part of the world, a part of us that has nothing to do with this world, but that it's like gradually gets around to integrating itself into the world of the senses, and then how this like continues to inform the process, and you have this continual like this landscape, this building relationship where you get an apparent path moving forward throughout time. I'm not sure how much of that was actually intelligible, but I think it's interesting to bring in other areas of sort of rigorous science that are also tackling this same essential problem. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Angus. Jeff, would you like to? Oh, you're muted.
Muted.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'm glad I got my hair cut. I would not want to be lesser than Max or Matt. And since this is a fabulous hair group, I feel the pressures, evolutionary pressures of my being to keep up. Okay. It's really interesting that a chapter on morality brings in Darwin and Darwinian notions of evolution. I find that juxtaposition very important, and the ways in which I found it important this time are different than ways I found it important previous. He seems to have succeeded in putting us back into nature through moral imagination and moral technique. And in fact, it doesn't seem that at this point we could actually achieve our evolution as humans unless we develop skills in relationship to moral imagination and moral technique. And that's not just because we face existential risk, but because evolutionarily speaking, the next step in evolution for humanity is developed moral imagination and moral technique. And it's really interesting here too. I always think about this when reading this chapter, that he also really establishes that we change the world. We have an impact on the world in the way nature, so-called nature, doesn't alter the world in which we inevitably have to. Now, there's a lot of self-loathing about that in our culture, but it's just a fact. So therein lies the responsibility. And I'm really, this is a word that keeps coming up, responsibility, throughout this work. And then here he lays it bare, that the way to take up responsibility is through moral imagination and in concert with people who, I run a business. I have a strong moral imagination and I suck at implementing things. So I'm really happy that I've got partners in that process. And I'm sure we wouldn't be able to pull off our podcast without Angus, because he actually has moral technique and relates to the technology. So I think that's it. The fact that we transform the world because we're human, and the responsibility that we bear because of that, I think, is a way to sum up this chapter. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I think that's, a really important way to frame the difference as you described it, or the distinction that we have as human beings from the rest of nature, in a way that doesn't aggrandize, but yeah, responsibility is a watchword, stewardship. Matt?
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that you made me think of, Jeff, and also try to unpack something I just put in the chat. So Steiner says that at the species level, we are each shaped and influenced profoundly by biological factors, right? But that as individuals, we are capable of intuitive thinking and free moral action. And in this context, I thought of something that Hegel says very early in the Phenomenology of Spirit. It might even be in the preface, or it's in the introduction, where he makes this analogy between organisms digesting their food to turn it into themselves, and the human knowing as a sort of digestion of percepts, or the sensory world, turning it into knowledge. And as Steiner points out, with Hegel, despite his brilliance, he remains sort of at the level of the general concept, and doesn't fully grasp the significance of individual thinking. And I think that's reflected in the way that Hegel doesn't fully continue or develop this analogy that he makes, because, obviously when animals eat, not only do they turn the food into themselves, they produce waste. And so what would the equivalent be in the case of human cognition? Well, it would be a kind of abstract knowledge that presents nature to us more as some kind of determinism, and we ourselves as part of that determinism, and it doesn't break through to this intuitive thinking capacity, or this free moral action. And so this knowledge builds up inside of us like a kind of toxin, and it takes on this toxic abstract form that only can be transformed by this higher process of digestion that Steiner's trying to teach us in this book. And then what happens to that? In that process of digestion, we transform perceptual food, but also abstract concepts into our own individualized mental pictures, which then afford the possibility of moral action. And so knowledge is then transformed into love, right? And can flow back into the world, not as kind of toxic waste of abstraction, but as free actions that transform the world and transform evolution into a spiritual process, right? So hopefully this analogy makes sense and is helpful. I don't know how many have read Hegel's Phenomenology, but it struck me that, it's a great metaphor, but it's not he doesn't follow it through far enough. So
It makes me think of that moment, or a couple moments in the Riddles of Philosophy that we all read, or most of us, when Steiner was, I think, talking about Hegel, and saying that Hegel uses he was talking about the concept and comparing it to a plant, and saying something like he uses it to make food or something like that, rather than to grow a new plant and move it further. Anyway, it just reminded me of that. Oh, so I wondered if maybe Steiner was thinking of that, moment in Hegel's writing when he was making those analogies. Mark?
Yeah, so I don't know if I've necessarily got a lot of insight to bring, but I definitely wanted to key off of Jeff's remark, and maybe a bit biographically, as somebody who was reared as an evangelical Christian. This chapter in particular has taken me maybe 25 years to sort of get my head around And it's just this, you know, very, very strong instance where these seemingly irreconcilable divisions, let's say within American culture, clash against each other, have a resolution in this understanding of this sort of like spiritual ecology or moral ecology that's being drawn out. And at the risk of becoming maybe a bit too American centric, another dimension that really comes out to me is sort of the understanding that I have, let's say, of the doctrine of originalism as it's practiced by certain members of the Supreme Court, who then want to go back and try to derive contemporary moral culture by teleporting themselves back, you know, to some antecedent time. And again, that's just an observation. I don't know if anybody will have any comments to that, but it's very striking to be confronted with the fact that evolution is this continuous process, and perhaps to your observations, Matt, there is, you know, this constant absorbing of percepts, digesting, and acting back onto the world. That seems to be very difficult for the wider culture to accept as the progress that we're making. And so we have all these regressive tendencies, clinging to antiquated notions and so forth. Anyway, thank you.
That's great, Mark. It really, you know, I think connects to Steiner's whole social threefolding vision, and how ideally the rights, the political sphere, all the laws would be emerging out of us in the present, and would really, I think, also inform the way that people think about the past, you know? But Lorenzo?
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I was wondering if anybody has any clear idea about how ideas, sorry for the repetition, are formed. That is, when Steiner says you could not imagine or derive the reptile from, let's say, the amoeba. Okay, we have these steps where once again you see that the reptile is a definite step, and so you have a discrete process with shapes and living beings that are shaped around an idea. From what I understood of the book so far, everything, every living thing has this let's say inner diagram or sign or image that we can call the idea. And so I was wondering, have you and I would also connect this concept of the idea, of the essence, let's say, with the concept of individuality, because we have been saying that we can sort of get out of the deterministic paradigm, because individuals are not just parts, but have their own unity. And I think that this unity that makes an individuality has something to do, or is the same thing that the idea, as we've been talking about it. And so this chapter makes me think that every novelty from, let's say, the outside coincides with the creation of a new individuality that distinguishes a new inside from a new outside. And that is what makes the novelty itself. So but what is then the key features that make an idea that make an individuality. What makes the step a step, so that the evolutionary process has this discrete step that we can then take and describe and think about. Do you agree with what I said, and do you have any ideas about this?
I have a quick thought, and I open it to see if anybody else has anything to say. But I was just thinking back to that moment earlier in the book where Steiner's talking about like describing a plant and how, you know, when you cut like a flower or something and it's no longer the plant, and we could, you know, freeze the plant at any given moment and, you know, sort of do a characterization of it, but it's always going to be, you know, in this process of metamorphosis. And so, and, you know, I was also thinking about what Max said earlier, that it's also like a networked, ultimately macrocosmic process. And so I don't know how to answer that. But those are some things that I thought of as you were speaking. Does anybody else? Would anybody else like to speak to it? Lorenzo Reyes? Feel free to just unmute.
I mean, just to say, I think the idea here, there's one archetype. I mean, you know, the way that Goethe found the archetype of plant metamorphosis, I think, is a special case of a more general archetypal form at work throughout the living world, and that every species, every genus, every species is an approximation of the anthropos. But one or another senses or organ systems becomes overemphasized due to specialization. But in a way, when we, from our human perspective, look upon the natural world from a spiritual point of view, what we're looking at is, and among all the diversity of species, different aspects of the human archetype sort of thrown out of proportion. And we gain a sense of the proportionality by reconnecting these various forms of species to ourselves, though not as a finished form, but as the best exemplification of the anthropos on the earth at present, right? We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but we can kind of calibrate the sense of proportion achieved in the human form by comparing it to the specialization of all the other forms of species around us. It's kind of how I think of it.
Can I say just one thing, address this very shortly, but if it was just like that, then we could derive the reptile from the amoeba.
I think we could derive...
You could derive everything from the anthropos, while the fact that there is novelty, I think, is what makes it so hard to make coherent. Say.
Yeah. I guess I would say more you could derive the reptile from the human, but not from the amoeba, because the form was still nascent, is too nascent in the amoeba. But I certainly grok what you're saying. I don't want to overemphasize a kind of archetypal finalism where everything's determined. Yeah. Should we, Chad, do you want to chime in? I think you had your hand up.
Yeah. Just real quick, did you mean derive the human from the reptile? I think you said it. Did I hear you say derive the reptile from the human? Because reptiles.
I know it's reversed from what you would expect, but I think that's, you know, in one way, the Goethean and Steinerian view of evolution is sort of a like metamorphosis of the anthropos rather than evolution to the anthropos. Like, it's the inverted view of the typical Darwinian picture.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Like amoebas are much more recent than reptiles, and reptiles are much more recent than humans, because reptiles are, let's say, animals are just what were plants in the last stage, and so they are like only 3 stages old, while we are 4 stages old, while a rock is much younger than us. It's just something that came out this very last phase of cosmic evolution. You have to look into that, otherwise it's confusing to bring all. But maybe it's the right time to bring this, since we are talking about evolution and anthroposophy. Yeah, there are 4 big stages in cosmic evolution since now. Maybe Angus, you could say something about this. You're the more knowledgeable about anthroposophy in general, but we are more complex because we are more ancient. It's once we were rocks, then when we got to become plants, what was nothingness became rocks. Then when we got to become animals, what was rocks became plants, and what was nothingness became rocks, and so on. So since we are the most evolved, let's say, of what we usually meet around, we are the oldest because we have all those stages inside us. So inert matter has just come out of nothingness.
That's not established in this chapter, of course, but I think Matt actually pulled off, and that was excellent, Lorenzo. I've never heard it said so beautifully. Really, but Matt also tied it to the chapter somehow, like tied it to this work. So it'll be interesting to see if in the following chapters we find that theme a little bit uncovered a little bit more. But it's definitely not established in this chapter. So this is, Chad, this goes back to a conversation you and I had where what I said about archetypes is that it sounded like you were binding it to evolutionary linearity, say.
Yeah, I'm very much evolutionary minded, and I've never heard that phrasing or framing that you just articulated, Lorenzo, and it makes sense. I get what you're saying. I just never heard it, and I never thought about it in that way. So it's completely new to me. And hopefully my comments won't take us too far afield, but it was inspired by something that Mark said about the Constitution and the originalist and the Supreme Court, because it made me think about how, or what I'm struggling with, but in the sense that the freedom of moral action that he's describing, the way I'm perceiving it, it's not entirely free in the way that I'm intuiting that he wants it to be. I think I understand what he's saying, but like, I was raised, in the 70s and 80s whereas my parents were raised during segregation, and like segregation was the norm for them. But I was raised post-segregation, and it was just like a moral ground, like it was already the instantiated evolutionary reality. And so, but that's something that was part of the evolution of consciousness, and it was free thinking, moral thinking that in individuals that led to the end of segregation. But yeah, I'm just, I'm struggling with that sense of like, we can never disconnect from the reality in which we are organically grown in. And it is a part of our constitutional ground or framework that, in a sense, you can't be free of, I think, is what I'm trying to indicate. And it's so much of our actual sense of morality can't be separated from the 10 Commandments and all of the previous moral development in human history. It's not something that is absolutely free and disconnected from everything that has come. So, and maybe that's what he's saying in this chapter, that it's really similar to Darwinian evolution in that sense. But yeah, that's just where my thoughts were going, and hopefully it didn't take us too far afield. Thanks for a really stimulating conversation, everyone.
Definitely not too far afield. I would say, I think that, Steiner would agree that this is a very situated, as they say, account of freedom, because the moral technique is always going to be in the context of that individual life, and the ethical individualism could only emerge out of the historical contingencies that you were describing. Jonathan?
Yes, it's wonderful how the chapter points to that new moral ideas, like a new idea of how to live together, then becomes a history of morality. And he points to that ethics can only be a history of morality. You can't really project it ahead, or else it's not real ethics, it's not really free new deeds. I wanted to speak to the point, sort of really to Lorenzo's point of thinking about how not to be determined, how to get sort of out of determinism. If, say, we're just fulfilling anthropos, what makes us different from or what makes morality kind of the crown of evolution? And I think it's wonderful that Max brought in this Rose Cross meditation, because that speaks very specifically to this, where it starts with the plant, and the plant is just, it just grows purely. It's like it's in this state of nature, and then immediately after that you put next to it the human being, and already you get a sense of how human beings, we're full of our desires and our whims and our wants and all this, and error comes in. And so there's I think this is somehow the mystery in a bit of a mystery in freedom and the indeterminacy, is we require this kind of error to come in. And so everything isn't just determined, everything doesn't just go according to plan. And so then there's questions, what do we do about this? And then we can reach for out of the archetype of anthropos, but that has an infinite ability to manifest. And so out of that, then we can sort of notice intuitively an idea. And then the chapter, but it's very important to speak to that's the moral imagination, but then the moral technique. And this is then whereby in all our error, and this might be why people find it difficult to sort of reconcile humanity and morality to evolution, because they say, well, look what a mess we're making. But if we can bring our consciousness in all its kind of error and missteps, and it's necessary, it's sort of the way it eats into life and destroys life, but nevertheless we can come to the point where we can actually then look to the plant, as Goethe did, and actually realize in our spirit, in our mind, the life of the plant, and then from that we can sort of bring life into our consciousness, and then purify our consciousness in the chaste laws of the natural world. And so I think in that way, that the fact that compared to a plant, that's, at least to start with, we're kind of a bit of a mess, because there's things have come in to create mistakes, but that leaves us that freedom whereby everything isn't determined. And you've made a smudge on the page, but we can make that smudge into something wonderful that has never been before.
Beautiful. Thanks, Jonathan. I love the image Steiner gives of the the sort of passions of the blood being transmuted into the beauty of the rose. Angus, and then we can end with Kate.
Yeah, I'm going to take us all the way back to Matt, but this will apply actually to what Jonathan was just saying as well. You mentioned you mentioned Paul But you were also talking about how this process of evolution that we're talking about in the moral sphere is also a process of overcoming the past. And my mind went straight to John 15. And it's if the world hate you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If ye were of the world would love his own. But because ye are not of this world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you. And this is also a description of how, so when we come with new moral imaginations and new moral techniques, we are challenging the old order, and the old order doesn't like it because it's not inspired by the same moral maxims, imagination, and technique that we are developing within ourselves. And I actually just looked back from that, and I just realized that that's actually the chapter of John where you've got reference to I am the vine. So you've also got this connection of this living world of spirit, which is what we are connecting to with this moral imagination, intuition, and technique. So it's you brought it to life in a very concrete way there, Matt and Jonathan and everybody actually, but I identified it with Matt.
Thanks, Angus. It's so great to, put the philosophy of freedom in this larger context, textual context. Kate?
Hi. I was thinking about a way to answer Lorenzo's question, and hopefully this is helpful. But to me, it's more of you have to think of it in more of an artistic way, where where someone is going to evolve to is the direction they're facing. And especially in this moral way, because he says the moral idea already exists as soon as I have the idea, but I think that you can change it constantly, and that happens when you're making art, when you start. And I like that Jonathan said make a smudge on the page, because when you start you can have an idea of where it's going to go, but obviously it unfurls out of itself and you're constantly reacting to what you've created and then adding on top of that. And that is what morality is doing when it's evolving. We're adding to it. And we wish that we could just say, this is how it has to be and this is finished and everyone must make this artwork this way. But no one does that. And I think the sad thing is that if you're an effective altruist, you kind of feel ashamed of the way that you respond newly to the world and have new ideas and new moral ideas, and you decide, oh, in this situation we must do it this way. I feel I must do it this way. And you feel sort of like it's always a compromise, but that's not a compromise at all. It's actually the real it's the essence of being human. It's not like it's not compromising the finished perfect idea with what's really there. It's actually always working on what's always there, like sculpting, and art is kind of in that. And I feel, the idea came from this children's book that I read by George MacDonald, and in it the character is given a power where he can, when he touches the hand of people, he feels an animal's palm, and the idea is that the person is going in the direction of that animal, and so he'll touch someone and they'll feel like a monkey or they'll feel like a reptile at some point. But the idea is that that's not a finished thing, that's just where it is in the moment, and they can always turn around. And I guess that's the idea of repentance. You can always decide, no, I'm actually going to be human. And that's why it's always a constant working artistic molding thing rather than a prediction. It can't be a prediction, it's just not possible.
Very deep. Very well said. I like the way you described also the moral I guess if you could call it moral orientation of the effective altruist, as if they're sort of making their potential for intuition subservient to a supercomputer that's trying to make the best future possible out of these abstract parameters. Well, this was great, as always. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. Next week, we'll be reading chapter 13. So look forward to seeing you all then.
Thanks, everyone.